So, welcome to our free New Year webinar on a Rewilded London. So, I'm going to hand over to Elliot Newton from Citizen Zoo, and he's going to take us through what he sees, what he reimagines a Rewilded London to look like. So, over to you, Elliot.
Well, thank you, Kieran, and good evening, everybody. Very happy New Year to you all. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be joining you virtually this evening on a relatively rainy start to the new year. But I think there's no better day in the entire calendar to start thinking forward and looking into the year ahead and seeing, what exciting projects and visions might be emerging over the coming months and years to aspire to live in a wilder, healthier planet to benefit both wildlife and local communities. So this evening, what we're going to do, we're going to take a tour through sort of what London might potentially be able to look like. Some of the projects are ongoing already, and lots of opportunities to get involved if you'd like to get involved. So just to quickly introduce myself slightly more formally, so as Kieran says, my name's Elliot Newton. I'm one of the co-founders of Citizen Zoo. And Citizen Zoo is a rewilding organisation that we put the community at the heart of all our conservation programs. And as we'll talk about this evening, just by the nature where most people live, so many of our conservation programs take place in urban spaces, trying to reimagine urban spaces and rebreathe life into them, sort of reset the bar about what we should expect in terms of nature within the places that we live and work. So this evening will be a sort of introduction to that. It's going to start off with just going through some definitions. I won't spend too long on definitions, but I think it's important to help set some context. Then we're going to look at both of some sort of the global perspectives when it comes to what urban nature looks like in other parts of the world. A bit of a flavour there, and then some historical context as well. So we're going to look at both a sort of a temporal and a spatial sort of level of urban rewilding. And then I'm going to jump onto some of the projects that Citizen Zoo is involved with. Some of you on the call might be aware of them already, or hopefully even participate in some of them, because as all the projects that I talk about, there's so many opportunities for people to get involved. So we'll talk about water voles, we'll talk about beavers, we'll talk about white storks, and then we'll talk about a project called Wild Tolworth. And at the end, I'll do a bit of a shameless plug again for the Rewild Futures Conference that is taking place at the University of Cambridge on the 17th and 18th of January. And we'll also, of course, talk about the Rewild London Symposium that is taking place later this year as well, which is a virtual event that is, again, hopefully going to be really inspirational sort of event that sort of helps to forward the rewilding movement within the urban context. So let's begin, shall we? So to be perfectly honest, I'm not a huge fan of definitions sometimes. I know definitions are incredibly important because they help us to communicate what conservation means. But rewilding is a term, as I'm sure that many of you agree, is a term that means so many different things to so many different people. But just to give a bit of historical context on where this word actually comes from, it was first sort of spoken about in the 80s. A chap called Dave Foreman, who set up something called the Rewilding Institute in the United States, was the first person to really coin the term. And then some biologists in 1998, a chap called Michael Soul and Reed Noss, really started to coin the term when in the context of what they had said the three C's, and that standard for cores, corridors, and carnivores, and how those three C's are really important to functional ecosystems. And much of their research was looking at the Yellowstone National Park with the introduction of an apex predator in the form of the wolf and the sort of trophic cascades that might then unfold by that apex predator once being back in the landscape, and how these predators influence not just their prey but the wilder ecology, and how everything, as I'm sure we all agree, is interconnected when it comes to nature. But I think people do get hung up on the term of rewilding. It is a term that can be very, very sort of received quite poorly among some communities because it has connotations that people might feel affronted towards their sort of traditional way of life when it comes to agriculture, etc. But when we talk about rewilding this evening, I'm not going to get too caught up in it, because one thing I really think, we're living in an ecological crisis at the moment. I as much as I like academia and academic discussions, I sometimes feel we can sometimes get a bit caught up, and it can be a little bit distracting when it comes to getting too caught up in sort of minutiae of details. So for this evening's sort of a presentation, when we talk about rewilding, we're going to talk about hope, the hope that this word can mean. I go into schools quite regularly. I talk to local politicians, I talk to businesses, and when you say the word rewilding, it really does light up people's eyes in the way that, say, maybe ecological restoration or nature recovery might not get that. So that emotive response of hope and positivity that rewilding can bring within the urban context, I think, is incredibly important. So and I wouldn't want to say to a child who's trying to put some nice pollinator friendly plants on their windowsill on their flat in a place where they might live in central London, and they say, I'm rewilding my window box, and if somebody goes to them and say, oh, actually that's not ecological, that's not rewilding in its truest form because it's not X, Y, and Z. I think we want to empower people to feel they can be part of this inclusive movement and really contribute to nature recovery around them, and I think rewilding is a really powerful term to do that. But one thing I would say that rewilding really should involve in all of its contexts is ecological processes. So when you're talking about it, you think not just about a species in the individual sense, but how the ecosystem functions as a whole, and really encouraging these functional, dynamic ecosystems and make them sort of natural as possible. So having that functional ecology, I think, is a true underpinning term that has to underlie any rewilding project, if it's urban, if it's rural, anything like that. But I do think we must always remember we want more people to be involved in nature conservation. We want more people to love nature, and we can use the word rewilding and the emotion that's behind that to do that. I think that is a really important thing to do. So that's when we talk about rewilding this evening. That's sort of what we're going to be clinging into. That sort of element, hope, ecological processes, and also mass participation, rewilding the soul, getting people involved. And the other thing I wanted to, well, obviously focusing on this evening, is the urban context. Urbanism is a really interesting word. It's a really interesting sort of spatial context when you look at a global perspective. If you look at the world's population, 55% of the world's population live in cities, and these cities occupy about 2% of the planet's surface. So we have our global context. We've got 55% of the world's population living on 2% of the world planet's surface. So that is, to me, a really interesting thing to think about, how we want people to engage with nature in their daily lives, and nature be part of where we live. And the urban environment is something we really need to do that. And if we did bring that from a global context to more of a UK context, the percentage is even greater. So in the UK, 84% of our population live within the urban setting. And this is expected to grow. For example, if we look at London, London now has a population of about 9 million people. By 2035, we're probably going to have a population of maybe 10 million people. So that is, to me, a huge opportunity there to engage with so many people of so many different magic, wonderful cultures and different ways of life, and bringing that melting pot of sort of cultural richness together to sort of think about nature as part of our daily experience and not something we have to travel out to. And that brings me to my next thought about sort of urban spaces, because what is an urban space truly? What does an urban space mean? Because it's not like something like an ancient woodland or a specific habitat type that has spent millennia of evolving, and we've got these specific criteria really of what these urban habitats should look like. Urban, by the definition, is sort of based on human innovation and human sort of ingenuity, and urban spaces look and feel as we sort of want them to. We are the architects, literally, of these spaces. So how an urban space looks really relies on the social will and the sort of demands of the people living there. And maybe sometimes I think we can maybe just play around with that a bit, and then we see if there's a way of trying introducing more nature into that space, because at the end of the day we have that will and ability to do that. And I think as we're moving into, we're now a quarter way through the 21st century, and we know that one of the biggest challenges of our time is not only the ecological crisis, but also the climate crisis. And the more that we can integrate nature into our urban environments, the more climate resilient these spaces will be. And also the health outcomes that will be benefited with that are incredibly important as well. We know, well, there was a really interesting study done by the UK, I think it was UK Health Alliance, a few years ago, in saying if people have good access to green space within the UK, that could potentially bring a saving of about £2.1 billion to the health of the community. And that, the sort of social, physical, mental well-being aspects of engaging with good nature. So not only from a sort of climate resilience perspective, but also a human resilience perspective. If we're living in more greener, more sort of nature-filled spaces, it's a better place for us all to live. And that sort of ties in with E.O. Wilson's biophilia sort of theory that every human has an innate will and sort of wish to engage with nature, and how we can unlock that, I think, is incredibly important. So I think there's true opportunities in the urban space to really redesign and think about how we can maximize opportunities for people to engage with nature, which will unlock a whole wealth of benefits that can transcend communities and generations. So yeah, these are two words we want to play with this evening: urban and rewilding, and how they can sort of mix. And I think the real excitement is we can play around with these words. There's no true set definition of what both of these things need to look like. So I'm now going to spend a couple of minutes just going through some places outside the UK, some other urban places where nature is embraced, or within the urban context, and just give you a little bit of a background to some of these spaces. Some of you might have been to these spaces, and I hope somebody might want to go to some of these spaces, because they are truly good places to visit. So one is Vancouver, so a population I think of around 700,000 people. And if anybody's been to Vancouver, it's a beautiful city. But one of my favourite things about Vancouver is Stanley Park. It's this 400-hectare park that's to the north of Vancouver that is full of, bald eagles. It's got otters. It's got we have beavers living in the park, as well as in the city of Vancouver, places like the Olympic Village. So again, it's a big population living alongside cheek by jowl with pretty sizable nature and quite a wealth of very impressive species. Another place that I had the luxury of visiting earlier, or actually last year now, one of my friends was getting married in Mumbai, so I went over to Mumbai. But I managed to go and meet some leopard researchers who were working out there. And Mumbai is a fascinating place. You have a population of about, well, the census hasn't been done for about 10 years, but when the census was done, I think about 24 million people living in Mumbai, probably higher than that now. It is the densest population, or the largest population and people living in a city in the whole of India. So that's a pretty sizable amount of people. But what I found most fascinating with Mumbai was living alongside nature. So Mumbai is the only capital city, or only city, sorry, on the planet that has a national park within this city confines. It's called the Sanjay Gandhi National Park. 104 square kilometers of national park that is literally surrounded by old and new Mumbai. And it's not on the outside, it's not on the outskirts of the city. It really is in the confines of the city, which is really impressive. They also have a Ramsar site in there as well. But what I thought was most fascinating was the leopard population, which I'm sure some of you might have seen on David Attenborough documentaries. But Mumbai actually has the densest population of leopards on the planet, which I think is absolutely mind-boggling. And you might think that would bring a whole host of issues in terms of conflict, but actually the conflict between humans and leopards is minimal, really. It's very rare for casualties to human casualties to take place. And actually most of what these leopards are eating are feral dogs, and in a way that is actually helping provide a service. So again, I think it's just fascinating to think, how you have such a huge community, a huge population living around leopards. For example, I went for a walk around the Sanjay Gandhi National Park one morning, and there were, some of you might be aware of these sort of park run things that happen, regularly across parks across the world. And I was walking through there, and people were doing this fun run. And as I was walking and watching these people run past, I was seeing leopard prints and leopard poo and stuff. And just imagine, people just living so sort of comfortably alongside leopards. It's quite an interesting thing to sort of challenge our own perceptions of what an urban space looks like. And then bringing it sort of more closer to home, look at Italy, for example, in Milan. These are some of my favourite buildings. It's slightly different context, really, but while we're integrating nature into the fabrics of the buildings themselves. So this is the Bosco Verticale in northern Milan, I think. And here we have the actual footprint of these two buildings is about It's about 3,000 square meters. But what they've managed to do is actually create about 30,000 square meters of vertical forest, which is thought to absorb about 19, or create about 19 tons of oxygen a year and absorb about 30 tons of CO2 a year. And if you walk around there, the sound of birdsong is fantastic. So I think what these sort of architectural sort of designs show us, that we have the ability to integrate nature into the fabric of our buildings. And there's some really interesting stuff happening in London to encourage more of this. And we'll talk about that as the talk goes on. But yeah, I think it really is a fascinating place to visit if you haven't done so already. And the last place I want to say from a building perspective, many people talk about it, is Singapore, you know, where we have the gardens of the bay, where these UK architects have come along and created these fascinating structures of these 18 solar powered super trees, just demonstrating how what an urban space could look like. You know, this looks almost alien, doesn't it? But again, the amount of nature, the vibrancy that you can have in these spaces, it really does help to sort of, you know, challenge perceptions is what's possible. And it's not always about sort of architectural or living alongside national parks or leopards. It can also be how we sort of perceive nature. So last international example I want to give you is in Costa Rica, in Curibá, which is part of San Jose. And in 2020, in Kiribati, they gave wildlife citizenship. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but it sounds pretty good to me. But yeah, so now it's how they actually sort of perceive wildlife, living around them. Wildlife is part of that community. So actually giving wildlife citizenship is quite an interesting context. So we can learn from this global, these global areas, these places across the world, and say how are people living alongside nature in other places, and how could that potentially influence us living in the urban spaces in the UK. So if we just jump to London quickly, I think which will be the feature of most of the rest of this talk. I'm sure many of you are aware of London, but as well as sort of this sort of spatial context of other cities around the planet, I think it's quite important to have historical context as well. So we're going to jump into a little bit of a time machine, and I'm sure if many of you have read the sort of seminal book of George Monbiot, you know, when they were feral, when one of the sort of the most quoted paragraphs I think of the book is when they were talking about digging the foundations for Trafalgar Square, when they were doing that in the 19th century, and they found hippo bones from over 100,000 years ago, which is quite interesting, isn't it? It obviously doesn't. I don't know how applicable that is to modern day life, and obviously so much climate variation has taken place over the last 100,000 years. But interesting to know that we had hippos, we had, you know, straight tusked elephants, we had lions running around in London. But if we come into more recent history, into 2000 years ago, 43 AD, when the Romans founded Londinium, London was a very interesting place then. You can see by this sort of image I've got from the British Museum, actually there was still quite a lot of agriculture 2,000 years ago. But again, much of London, I love this picture here. It must be something, maybe part of the effort or something. I'm not entirely sure. But you know, London would have had these huge wetlands that were sprawling. The Thames itself would have been much wider. We would have had, you know, beavers would have been prolific. We would have had wooded areas. We would have had, you know, it would have been a very vibrant sort of ecological setting. You know, it would have been, you know, the fish would be sort of in their thousands swimming through these complex wetlands, and you'd have wild boar running through these sort of ancient woodlands and red squirrels. So it's quite interesting to think about how London has changed over the last 2,000 years, where it has sort of been more of a civilized sort of setting. And if you come to more recent memories, where with the Victorian period, one of my favourite writers is Richard Jefferies, who was a Victorian naturalist who did a lot of writing, and he sort of lived in London. He actually lived in Kingston, not too far from where I'm sitting right now, in about 1877, and he saw the sort of mass industrial explosion, industrial revolution take place in London during that period. Between 1800 and 1870, London's population went from 1 million to 5 million. And he sort of witnessed that huge growth. And even despite that huge amount of industrial activity and sort of development, he still, in 1883, wrote a book called Nature Near London, which was an amazing book. I encourage many people to read it, anyone to read it really. And it just shows you, even in that time of industrialization, that there was so much wildlife in London. And London does have a really interesting perspective when it comes to protecting nature. For example, Wimbledon Common, which was designated in 1871, was one of the first places on the planet to be designated a place for nature, really. Even 1871 actually predates the national park movement in the Americas. For example, Yellowstone, which was the first national park out there, was designated in 1872. So really good history of us trying to protect nature. And to this day, some great rewilding projects are taking place on Wimbledon Common. It's currently receiving funding from the Rewild London grant to restore Queensmere Pond. So if anybody goes down to Wimbledon Common soon, in the near future, you'll see some big ecological restoration places, projects taking place there. So really exciting stuff. But if we look at London more today and what it looks like now, this is a good map that we have from the GLA, the Green Infrastructure Map, and it just shows you how much of Greater London is green space. A lot, and it's more than some people might first expect. We look at the 33 boroughs of London, so about 49.5% of London is green space or blue space. Obviously, one of the most important blue things is the River Thames. This 215-mile river flowing through the heart of London. Is obviously at the core of our ecology, but also of our green spaces that we have around it. London's got about 16,000 species living in it. The BTO suggests we have about 369 bird species recorded here. I think I'm a huge fan of bats. We've got 11 species of bats living in London. We've got about 125 species of fish living in and around our waterways. So actually London is an incredibly biodiverse space, which I think is something we should celebrate. Of course it could be better, of course it could be more biodiverse, but I think there's some really exciting things happening. And in terms of, if we ignore rewilding at the moment, we're living through quite an interesting time from a policy and a legislation perspective. The recent Environment Bill is seeing us now, the GLA are now the lead authority on creating local nature recovery networks for London, the local LNRS, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, and that's going to enter the final part of the consultation in the coming months. So please do look for the work happening around that, which is looking at interconnectivity of green spaces and trying to highlight priority species and how we can try and really make green and resilient ecologies in our urban setting. Of course, there's other stuff within the development realm, biodiversity net gain, and also something called the urban greening factor, which is part of the London plan, which is policy G5, which again a really interesting way of how we should integrate nature into our cities. So rewilding apart, there's some really exciting things that are happening within our London context right this very moment. But one of the most exciting things I've seen happen in recent years is the declaration of London becoming a national park city. It was the world's first. And I think, what does this really mean? I think it's open for definition to some extent. But what this does by having a national park city, it hopefully raises our perspective, raises our imagination, opportunities for innovation, and just thinks, what does it mean to live in a national park city? Going to a school, getting them to think about, well, what does it mean? How can we redefine the green spaces around us and raise that bar when it comes to having nature living around us? So really exciting project that is taking place. You can actually check them out. They're a fantastic organisation. They have lots of rangers that do lots of things. So do check out the London National Park City. But I think it's pretty cool that we're living in the world's first one. And then that is a movement that's great gaining pace across the world. But now bringing back to rewilding very quickly, and then this is what we'll now, the next sort of 10 minutes, we're going to just focus more on rewilding projects and rewilding context. So in 2022, London saw the formation of the London Rewilding Task Force. Citizen Zoo was very honoured to be part of that, which is a really great piece of work. So this was a bit of work spearheaded by the GLA and the London Wildlife Trust on how rewilding might impact and influence London. It's a fantastic report that was published in 2023 that I suggest that people go and check out and just read about that report. This is some of the members. You can see our chair there, Pamela Abbott, sitting next to Sadiq Khan himself, which was quite a great movement to see all these brains coming together across the UK to think about how rewilding could be applied to the urban context. And one thing that the rewilding group has sort of morphed into now, something I'm very privileged to sit on, is the next stage of how that report can be integrated. So if you look at the report, there's these recommendations about different zones that can be rewilded. And now there's a working group that's looking at, again, led by the GLA and the London Wildlife Trust, but how some of these big core key areas could be turned into really fantastic rewilding zones. Zone 1 there is Enfield Chase, and actually Enfield are already doing some absolutely fantastic work in this space. So they're doing some really great. So do check out the work that's going on in Enfield, because it's really special. But just bringing it back to some of the projects that we're working on that you might potentially want to get involved with, which at Citizen Zoo. So Citizen Zoo, just to remind you, we're an organisation that puts communities at the hearts of our conservation projects. So all of our conservation projects are sort of led by local people and moulded and shaped by local people to try and make these projects as inclusive as possible. So one of the projects that I want to quickly tell you about is our water vole project. The project's called Get Involved, because it just to sort of re-emphasise the importance of bringing people together to be part of this conservation programme. I'm sure some of you are aware that water voles are sadly the UK's fastest declining mammal in the UK in my lifetime, which is about 30 years, just over. We've lost potentially 97% of our water voles, and that is a really important part of our river ecology. Water voles are the bedrock of our ecological ecosystems, holding up the prey base, spreading seeds, creating complex habitats in the banks. So they are a really important part of our ecology. And on a river that we work on in southwest London called the Hogs Mill, we did back in 2019 actually, we ran a complex a community-led habitat survey looking at different attributes of the river, trying to work out what the habitat was like for water voles, because water voles sadly went extinct on the UK on the Hogs Mill in 2017. So this was a project trying to work out how we can try and bring this species back, but enabling the community to really drive that aspiration and that to achieve that vision. So this habitat survey enabled local people to go out and survey our river. So with support with the Ecological Record Centre for London, which is called Giggle, we managed to create this fantastic map, which identified areas where water vole habitats were identified as positive in terms of the habitat was suitable for water voles. And that then said that then was our sort of our starting moment, thinking, okay, all right, we can actually try and potentially achieve this goal of bringing water voles back because there is some suitable habitat. So over the last 5-6 years or so now, we've been working with hundreds of volunteers across the Hogs Mill with lots of different organisations as well, bringing people together to try and restore habitats, plant water vole friendly plants, and try and make the river more suitable for water voles. And in 2022, we actually released 101 water voles back to the river, which was pretty exciting. We're still getting records of them now, but of course, by releasing them, that's not by any means the end of the story. We have to monitor them, and one of the most important things of water voles is monitoring American mink populations. So we put out these things called remote rafts to monitor the presence of American mink. And we know that Hogs Mill doesn't have an established population of mink, which is really important for the long-term suitability for water voles. But this is technology that's been taken by, which was sort of developed by the Water Life Recovery East project, who work in East Anglia. Maybe some of you might have seen that East Anglia is now clear of mink, and we're seeing water vole populations start to thrive across East Anglia now. And as I mentioned in a moment, the Zoological Society of London have formed something called the London Water Vole Working Group, which we're proud to be part of, and now working with the Water Life Recovery East project and various funding streams, there's more and more of these remote rafts being deployed across London right now, which is really trying to encourage, I think it does mean that water voles will have a potential good future within London. London's got about 600 kilometres of tributaries and streams, so there really is quite a lot of potential for more water voles to be brought back. So this is me looking actually in flagrant disregard of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, because we'll sometimes catch grey squirrels in our traps, and it's technically not allowed now to release them, but unfortunately grey squirrels everywhere, so it wouldn't be too beneficial to our ecologies just to cull them on this sort of project. So but anyway, this is how we monitor and try and sort of control mink within the London context, and it's proved fantastically successful in other places. So a really exciting project. And because we know we've got habitat, and there's no mink within our Hogs Mill, and we've already got one population established, we're now looking to establish novel population further downstream, and later this year we're going to be doing another release working with South East Rivers Trust and Natural England to do another water vole release, and these water voles are going to be sourced by a great organisation called Rewilded, who have a great zoo. I encourage you to go check out in Kent, and they've got another one over in Devon as well. But yeah, so later this year we're going to be doing more water vole reintroduction. So if anybody wants to get involved with water voles in the Hogs Mill, please do let us know. And also, as I say, ZSL have set up this London water vole working group, so there's lots of opportunities to get involved across London, not just on the Hogs Mill. And we're trying to help support that where we can. And from a smaller rodent to a bigger rodent, beavers are an amazing species. I implore many of you to go listen back to a talk that Sean McCormack did a couple of months ago or weeks ago now with Kieran, talking about the Ealing Beaver project that I'll mention in a moment. But yeah, so I won't spend too long on beavers, but beavers are a really incredible animal. As an ecosystem engineer, they've it's almost unrivaled abilities of being able to breathe nature back into our landscapes. Many people think of beavers, they don't normally think of them as a species that is too suited to living in the urban settings, but again, that's quite simply not correct. They're not a wilderness species. They're a species that can survive and thrive in urban settings. We see that in places across Europe, from Berlin to Stockholm to Munich to places like Vancouver that I mentioned earlier. So actually, beavers are very well adapted to living in urban spaces, and by having their presence here, they can help increase our resilience to climate change through reducing the threats of flooding, or helping mitigate the impacts of flooding and drought, and also water quality, as well as creating some really complex wetlands that are great for a whole wealth of species. And so we've established back in 2021, I think it was, we established something called the London Beaver Working Group, bringing people together across London, thinking about how can we have more beavers within London, and how can we see them as a real asset to our community, and how can we live alongside them to benefit a whole range of things. So we working with a fantastic collaborative project, working with a group called the Ealing Wildlife Group, with Ealing Council, with the Friends of Horsenden Hill. We at Citizens Zoo helped to establish the Ealing Beaver Project, a place called Paradise Fields in Ealing, and this is the UK's only fully urban and accessible beaver enclosure. So you can walk into this site and you can see the beaver landscape and sort of be immersed within that setting. So we now have school children walking to school in Zone 4 London through a beaver enclosure, and it's the wildlife, we're already starting to see incredible species show up, and more vibrant wildlife biodiversity, as well as more resilience to the impacts of flooding. For example, last year when we had flooding, it was one of the first years that the local train station wasn't flooded, and what in years previously it was, and we think the beavers were part of that. And a really exciting project. So please do check out the Ealing Beaver Project, and Kieran will share a link, and it's a great project to get involved with, and you can go down whenever you want. It's a completely accessible site, and it's great to release the beavers. So we've got Rasheen there in the middle, who's an amazing person from the Beaver Trust, and she's the person who helped to guide our project and source our beavers. So it really was fantastic to get beavers in London, and pleased to say they're thriving. They've had kits this year, or last year I should say now. So they are really demonstrating that we can live alongside beavers, and they can get fantastic results. There's two more projects I want to quickly tell you about. One is the White Stork project that we're starting to work on at Citizen Zoo, and this is with funding from Rewilding Britain, another great organisation who do lots of rewilding work across the UK. And it might sound a bit outlandish to talk about white storks in the urban context, but I just want to show you this slide, which I think is pretty fascinating. And one thing, white storks can be slightly controversial. Some ecologists will say they're not truly native species to the UK, and that is a really interesting discussion that I think should be played out. But there is certainly some evidence of white storks breeding in the UK, not least in Edinburgh and St Giles Cathedral, but also there's regular accounts of these white storks living, being sold in London game markets in the 16th century. And that period, it had been very difficult to get these birds, ship them across the channel and stuff. So we think those birds would have been quite local. So I think there's strong and compelling evidence that white storks would have lived in and around London in the past, especially for such a mobile creature that has these huge migrations and small distances fences don't mean much to white storks. And there's some really interesting sort of history elements. One of my favourite stories is this poster here from, I think it's a World War One poster, or during that period of during the underground. And at that time, there were some domestic sort of flightless birds, white storks, living in Kew Gardens. I think so they've got a history of living around in Kew. And in World War Two, actually, where the birds were still there. And the grounds maintenance keeper, when he was doing a nighttime check around Kew Gardens, was walking around the gardens at night, and he felt a sharp object sort of touch his back, and he thought, "My gosh, are we being invaded by sort of parachuting invading armies?" But actually, he turned around, and it wasn't a bayonet in his back; it was actually just the beak of a white stork, just giving a bit of a peck. So there's some really interesting sort of accounts of white storks within the London context. But if you bring it more forward into the recent memory, that this is a really interesting data collected by Giggle. And if you can see here, in 2014, there was one record of white storks flying across London. But if you bring that forward to more recent times, 2021, you can see white storks actually had about 265 sightings. So we're starting to see white storks fly and forage within the London setting more and more. And this is primarily because of the fantastic work of the White Stork Project, places like Knepp Estate, where we're seeing more white storks now start to breed in Sussex, and they're flying into London. And white storks, if you look across Europe again, similar to beavers are a species that's well adapted to living in urban settings. But unlike beavers, these aren't species that are ecosystem engineers. They're not going to help particularly with things like flooding, but what they can do, they can help be a real symbol of hope and ecological recovery. And these are birds that I think can help to engage many people. For example, in London, we have about 200 different languages that are spoken in London. It's one of the most incredible mixes of ethnic diversities in the world, I would say. But unfortunately, that's not really reflected in our conservation movement. But if we have these amazing talismanic birds, it might help to encourage more people to actually understand the nature around them and be a gateway to getting involved in more nature. So over the course of next year, what we're going to be doing at Citizen Zoo, we're going to be setting up a London White Stork working group. We've already had one meeting already, and that's been really successful. We're going to be doing more habitat mapping with Giggle, looking at what habitats are available for these white storks, looking at various sort of risks that might be that should be considered when it comes to white storks. Doing lots of community engagement, raising awareness of the history of white storks within London and the brilliance of these marvellous birds. And also just looking to consider some sort of maybe a white stork recovery plan about how potentially can we make London more white stork friendly, and what options might be available to us to have these birds breeding within our capital. I think it could be an absolutely powerful project that could really inspire potentially millions of people about the riches of nature we could have within our urban settings and engage so many more people in nature. The last project I just quickly want to tell you about is our Wild Tolworth project. This is a project we're working with again, a truly collaborative project, working with Kingston Council, who are the landowners of this site. It's Kingston's biggest nature reserve at 43 hectares in size. We're also working with a community partner called the Community Brain, who are a fantastic group at engaging communities in the arts and do a whole wealth of amazing, fantastic, sort of innovative and colourful engagement of projects, mainly using the arts and engage a wealth of people through those work streams. So really trying to bring as many people into this project as possible, and it's funded again by the GLA and by the National or the Heritage Lottery Fund. So this is a site, as I say, it's about 43 hectares, or about 100 acres in size. So it's not a huge site, but it's very well connected as part of this ecological green sort of ribbon. So really part of a core wildlife corridor. And over the course of the last 5 years or so, working with people like Kieran and a whole host of other organisations, we've been doing some of the most in-depth ecological sort of surveys on the site to really understand what ecologies are lying on this site at the moment, in terms of looking at the floral communities, using technology like bioacoustic sensors to look at the bird and mammal populations, as well as more formal surveys such as typical butterfly transects and bird surveys. We've also been doing lots of field recorder days with taxonomic experts coming down to look at various invertebrate communities. So we now have an incredible understanding of the site's ecology, which gives us a great place to start with when it comes to coming to design a rewilding project. So the course of this year, it's exciting to say this year now, we're going to be building a fantastic wetland on site, which is going to actually restoring where the wetland once flew. And this is going to be really exciting because we have to show you how we can build a wetland amongst all the constraints that you have in urban settings, such as sewage pipes and electric cables and stuff. So and obviously working with the local community. So really good example of how we can have these dynamic flowing wetlands and still within these relatively constrained and confined spaces. And on top of the wetland creation, we're looking to introduce a sort of rewilding grazing program, focused on based on works of rewilding projects in rural places across the UK, where we'll be using cattle as analogues for aurochs. So these cattle are going to be moving around the site all year. We'll be using no fence collars to sort of monitor their activity and help control their presence. So that's really exciting. We'll be getting cattle on site this year. We'll also be getting pigs on site, which will be a form of helping us imitate sort of wild boar roostling behaviours in typical sort of you see in many rewilding projects. But this will be the first time we think this has been done in this way within the London context, hopefully showing other sites that we can actually unleash these smaller areas for rewilding, which could open so many doors. We want to also consider other species, like is there the potential for things like glowworms, which I think really do have so much in the way of magic when it comes to engaging people with nature. So hopefully in the future we'll be able to go to sites like Tolworth Court Farm and you'll see glowworms glowing in the dark as you're walking through the evening. On the day you'll see white storks potentially clattering on the top of trees and these herbivores moving around, and this could all be a stone's throw where people live, and hopefully something that I think could be really, really exciting. And all I want to sort of finish to sort of talk on, I think it's maybe 3 or 6 more days of this. So this is an exhibition that is called Brilliant Birds at the Natural History Museum. So if anyone can get down to the Natural History Museum in the next few days, or if you have been, I think it's been going for some months now, but the last exhibition within this sort of, last room within this exhibition is an amazing room which shows you the potential of what 2050 could look like in urban spaces. And it's this amazing sort of immersive room, and it's what it is like to wake up in the dawn chorus in 2050 in these urban settings. And you can see here you have these streams that are meandering through these urban environments with green trees and green infrastructure within the buildings and people cycling and local food growing and so many birds. And then on the outskirts you have these amazing wetlands with there's a little beaver here that you can see, and it's fantastic to show these potential of what urban rewilding could look like in these spaces. I thought it was a really hopeful way to sort of start the year, is to thinking about what could our urban spaces look like in 2050. I think this graphic representation of the dawn chorus done by the Natural History Museum is a really exciting and compelling vision. There's definitely a future that I would like to live in, and hopefully some of the projects that I've spoken to you about this evening and that wider work that's going on will help to contribute to that vision. And I really, really hope it does come to fruition. So that brings me to the end of my sort of formal talk. Thank you all for listening. But as we said at the start, there's 2 things we want to tell you about before we finish. And as we're talking about the future and the future of rewilding at Citizen Zoo, we're very proud to be putting on a global rewilding conference that's going to be taking place at the University of Cambridge on the 17th and 18th of January. So only a couple of weeks away now, and people will be coming in from across the world to show how rewilding projects are delivering some really fantastic goals or outcomes for both nature and for people in some amazing settings. So for example, we have the CEO of Rewilding Chile coming along to talk about how their rewilding programs work out there. Similar in Rewilding Argentina, we've got people coming across from North America talking about Rewilding America. We've even got people from America talking about the de-extinction technologies, which are quite controversial, but I think incredibly potentially powerful, and something that is happening about how they're trying to bring species back from extinction. So they're going to be talking about what they're working on, which I think will enlighten some really interesting discussion and dialogue. And then we've got people coming from Mozambique, for example, the Gorongosa National Park, where showing how places that have been quite recovering from war and civil war, and how they've created these amazing national parks that have recovered and now teeming with life, and also fantastic ways to develop communities. And people coming from Australia across rewilding across Europe. It really promises to be one of the most exciting rewilding events in the calendar for 2025. So if you are around, please do come along. And it's not just about the global context. We've got many people presenting from a UK perspective as well, from the Wildlife Trust's Natural England, lots of projects. So please do check it out online. And we've only got a few tickets left now, so please do book if you'd like to come along. And I know Kieran is sharing a link in the chat. And as Kieran mentioned at the start, there's also later this year the Rewild London Virtual Symposium. Kieran, I don't know if you're better placed to give this a plug rather than myself, but I promise this to be a fantastic event as well.
Yeah, well, just to point out that it is cheap as chips, so we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. So tickets are tenner for non-professionals and £25 for professionals, but people can get their tickets to as low as £1 if the fee's an issue. So the more the merrier. We want to really spread the word about some of the fantastic initiatives going on in London. 3 of our minimum of 4 speakers are already booked in. Elliot's going to be hosting. But the speakers that are booked in, we've got Renature London that'll be talking about their work in Hackney Marshes. We've got the London Wildlife Trust talking about their chalkland restoration work to provide grasslands for butterflies and other chalkland animals and plants. And we've got the Force, the Friends of the River Crane Environment, talking about the River Crane Smarter Catchment, which is an initiative by Thames Water to empower local grassroots rewilding along the river corridor. So yeah, so that's it basically, Elliot, for me about that. But booking's available online.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, please do sign up to both of those events. They sound really exciting. What better ways to start 2025 than thinking about some really great nature recovery rewilding projects. So, Kieran, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present to you and to the group this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No problem. A couple of things I'll just mention before we go into the Q&A is, first of all, Citizen Zoo do a fantastic rewilding newsletter, and I really recommend that people sign up. It's completely free. You don't have to pay to be a member or anything like that. So I'm just dropping a link for that in the chat. And I also dropped the link in the chat earlier for the Free Biological Recording Company newsletter. It's a little bit different. It focuses more on biological recording initiatives rather than specifically rewilding, but it's worth signing up, and there's loads of free events that go live via that as well.